Welcome again to our second keynote speaker. It's a great pleasure to introduce to you this fine Spanish philosopher, Dr. Joaquin Valdivielso Navarro. I've had the privilege to know Joaquin for more than 10 years, and we share many philosophical interests, and I'm happy to say to you that every time that we are together, of course, we discuss philosophy, and every time I learn something substantial from our talks. Joaquin Valdivielso is Associate Professor of Moral Philosophy at the Department of Philosophy and Social Work at the University of the Balearic Islands. And for those who do not know what they are, that's, for instance, Mallorca. His PhD thesis in philosophy was the first Spanish monograph on André Gortz's political philosophy. As a member of the research group on practical philosophy, called Praxis, and the interdisciplinary lab on climate change of the University of the Balearic Island, his research interests deal with contemporary moral and political philosophy, mainly on critical theories of society and ethics and politics of the environment. He has participated in socio-environmental studies and analyses on Mallorca and in current debates around issues like the role of philosophy in education for citizenship in Spain. On the whole, he explores relations between, on the one side, moral and political philosophy, and on the other, social and political movements and public debates. He has participated in research projects with public funding since 1997 and is now co-directing the project Biological Reproduction, Social Reproduction, and Public Sphere. This project I'm actually happy to be part of, and we even have some other members of the project present here at Campus Emdrup, where they have the workshop Reproduction here at our annual meeting. Among Joaquin's grants are the distinguished Marie Curie scholarship, and he's made long-term research stays on the famous New School for Social Research in New York, at the School for Politics, International Relations and the Environment at Keele University in the UK, at the Interdisciplinary Center for Social Studies at the University of Rosario, Argentina, and at the National University of Brasilia in Brazil. He has been invited to deliver several international guest lectures, including being a keynote speaker at the prestigious International Critical Theory Seminar on Philosophy and Social Science in Prague at the Institute of Philosophy at the Czech Academy of Sciences. There I heard him talk about civil resistance in relation to Occupy Wall Street and the Spanish Indignados and Podemos. And here, at the school in Emdrup, years ago I benefited from his lecture about citizenship education. Joaquin has made numerous contributions to international conferences and seminars, published or edited 11 books, written a number of book chapters and articles to journals, translated text from English, French, and Portuguese to Spanish by authors such as Nancy Fraser, Andrew Dobson, André Gortz, and Ulrich Beck. So, Joaquin is a fine philosopher, and he's also a good colleague and friend who has pressured me to develop my Spanish language. So I'm grateful to Joaquin for sharing his knowledge and insight with me and for encouraging me to pursue my own international endeavors. So today he will invite you into his sphere of knowledge by talking about the value of nature. So, Joaquin, the floor is yours. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Okay. Thank you, Andre. Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Asge, for your presentation, and thank you to the Danish Philosophical Society for inviting me to this meeting. This is an honor to me. I'm very pleased to be here, but I'm at the same time very challenged coming from the periphery of the periphery in the south of Europe. Being here is something impressive. I would like to apologize also because I'm not able to give my presentation in Danish or any other Scandinavian languages you might be familiar with. I'll do it in English. My English is pretty rusty, so let me know if you don't understand something. I'll do my best. I'm not sure about the title of this presentation. I had to improvise it, and maybe I would change it, but let me explain you what I will try to do here tonight. My aim is to pose some questions around the relationship between value and the environment and how it has been raised in philosophy. And I'm interested in particular in the theory effect of philosophy, and in particular moral philosophy, in what is called the rights of nature movement. I don't know if you're familiar with that. If not, I will try to present more or less its main traits. For that, I will start with a particular case that is taking place in Spain. I promise not to be too parochial. I promise that I'll come later to a broader outlook and to pose some examples from all over the world. But I will start with this case in Spain, which is a case of what is called rights of nature legislation. Afterwards, I will present what I consider are the three main approaches in ethics and the environment. I will put a special emphasis on what is usually called environmental ethics. And finally, I will return to the question of the rights of nature. I have presented very briefly on the first part, and I will try to reach some considerations. My main goal is pretty modest, is to share with you my surprise because of the particular theory effect that philosophical reflection, in particular some moral philosophical reflection, and in particular some specific notion of value in nature, is having on this legislation on the right of nature all around the world. As you can imagine, this is a very complex issue. Therefore, I will be necessarily simplistic and synthetic. I hope not to be naive, but I will simplify something which is very complex. As is usually said in natural and ecological sciences, I will simplify complexity. So I excuse in advance for that. So this is more or less the plan I will follow. First, I will do an introduction with this Mar Menor Lagoon case that I will explain very briefly. Afterwards, I will stop in these three approaches to the problem of value in nature and the environment in philosophy. And I will, in particular, center my reflections on the first of these three approaches, environmental ethics. And finally, I will try to read some final remarks or considerations. So, to begin with, I will refer to this very recent case of recognition of a natural entity as a legal person. This is important in my presentation, this idea of legal person or legal personality or legal personhood, which means in this context the same. This is just one more case in a long series of what is commonly considered a rights of nature movement. This term, rights of nature, is usually referred to a social movement. But in fact, more than a social movement, it is a sort of trend in the field of law, and in particular in legislation, at different domains, mainly local and national, and not that much international still today, by now. So this is a very recent phenomenon from the last 2 decades, although its philosophical inspirations have a longer history. So this is Mar Menor. Mar Menor means minor sea, where the major sea is the Mediterranean Sea. This is a 135 square kilometers saltwater lagoon located near Cartagena in southeast coast of Spain. It's a fragile and unique ecosystem under severe anthropic pressure, mainly because of tourism, urbanization, and agrochemical pollution. Since 2016, so 6-7 years ago, when pollution was reported to render the area close to ecological collapse, a group of legal advocacy jurists, hand in hand with a growing popular mobilization, triggered a process that led to the approval of a law, the Act 19/2022, last September, this is just a few months ago, for the recognition of the legal personality for the Mar Menor Lagoon, this space you are watching on the presentation, on the slide, and its basin. Here you have some images of this process that ended with the approval of this law. And this is the law. Let me reproduce some passages, some extracts from the Act. The emphases are added. The time has come to take a qualitative leap and adopt a new legal political model, in line with the international legal vanguard and the global movement for the recognition of the rights of nature. This Act aim is to grant legal personality to the lagoon ecosystem of the Mar Menor, in order to endow it as a subject of rights with a charter of its own rights based on its intrinsic ecological value and intergenerational solidarity. Recognizing the rights of the ecosystem of the Mar Menor Lagoon and its basin means complying with our acquired international commitments, such as the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and living up to the demands of the new geological period in which our planet has entered, the Anthropocene. In this century, the serious ecological damage caused by the human development model forces us to expand our responsibility towards the natural environment. At the same time, granting rights to the natural entity of the Mar Menor strengthens and expands the rights of the people who live in the lagoon area. In accordance with the proposal of an ecocentric interpretation of our legal system, indicated both by the Supreme Court, the Spanish Supreme Court, and some legal operators, the category of subject of rights should be extended to natural entities, based on the evidence provided by the science of life and the earth systems. These sciences allow us to base a conception on of the human being as an integral part of nature and forces us to face the ecological degradation suffered by planet Earth and the threat that this entails for the survival of human species. Thanks to the status of being a legal person, the Mar Menor as a legal person, the Act allows that any natural or legal person is entitled to defend the Mar Menor ecosystem through legal action in courts. And thanks to that, to the declaration of the Mar Menor as a legal person, different values are promoted, as the text of the law says explicitly. These values are the right to exist as an ecosystem and to evolve naturally, including its right to protection, conservation, and restoration, because of its intrinsic value. Therefore, the aforesaid judicial action will be presented on behalf of the Mar Menor ecosystem as the true interest party. I'm sure that you notice my emphasis on this sort of language. A lagoon as a true interest party, intrinsic value, and so on. So another value is expanding the rights of the people, including future generations, in the face of socio-environmental crisis, and fulfilling climate international obligations, such as the Paris Agreement. Environmental advocacy groups find something like that a real success. To me, this is surprising. This is a sort of language with strong philosophical roots, which is very uncommon in the legal language, idiom, and arguments. This is not a sort of expressions of semantics I would have expected to find in a legal text. In any case, this case, the Mar Menor Lagoon case, follows a common pattern in the rights of nature legislation that we can find in many other places. In the last part, I will give you some examples of that. This is more or less the pattern of the rights of nature legislation in terms of the rationale in it. The claim of an ecocentric turn in the legal system, the strategy of considering a natural entity as a legal person, a mix of ecocentric and anthropocentric values, the development of legal mechanisms of tutela, which is action for protection, by citizens on behalf of the natural entity, which is the true interest party, as I said before, and the goal of protecting the environment. Well, let me try to explain why, to me, this is surprising. At least for a normative point of view, let's say for a philosophical, ethical point of view. And then I pass to the second part, and I will try to explain this threefold classification of the different approaches in ethics and the environment, and the different notions of value they present. If I had to organize a library on ethics and the environment from a thematic point of view, I would form three groups of books. That is to say, I believe that there are three ideal types of approaches that at the same time are three different moments in the history of the reflection on ethics and the environment. Three moments in the sense that more or less they followed one another in a more or less linear way in time. Still, you can imagine that if we zoom in, we will see a constellation of mixed examples. In any case, I think that these three ideal types explain many things. The first approach, which is usually called environmental ethics, till the point that this specific approach, environmental ethics, is usually confused with the philosophy or the moral philosophy of the environment, is based on the idea of intrinsic value, which means that there's value in nature. I'm sure that you noticed that this intrinsic value appeared in that legislation in the Mar Menor example I posed. The second approach will be ecological ethics, which usually is not prone to use this language of intrinsic value and this idea of value in nature. Instead of that, I would say that the preferred approach is to think of value as something that is given or created by humans, so that we have value of nature related to humans. And the third approach is what today is the fashion, which is climate ethics. So in this case, value is climate stability. I will start with the first one, and I will refer later very briefly to the other two. I will stop here in environmental ethics because there is a very differential influence of these three different approaches in the rights of nature movement. In the rights of nature movement, this is the preferred approach by large. So this approach of environmental ethics was conceived with the explicit goal of overcoming anthropocentrism. the meta-ideology underlying industrial society, where no human nature is considered a mere means devoid of value or self-interest. Since its inception, the concept of environmental ethics has remained faithful to a relational notion of nature, inspired by ecological science, where natural beings are conceived as part of the web of life, biotic community or biospherical net or field of intrinsic relations, in the words of Aldo Leopold or Arne Naes. Against methodological atomism and human nature dualism, this holistic view informs the extension of the community of moral consideration to include non-human beings. The primary strategy in environmental ethics has been to deem that nature, or at least some parts, some elements of nature, possess intrinsic value, and that the environment is therefore not simply a medium to serve human interest. The environmental ethicist assume that intrinsic value generates for human beings duties towards non-human natural beings. I would say, and please excuse this simplification, that the environmental ethics has faced and is still facing today 3 different challenges. The first is the problem of ranking natural values. It means the identification of a hierarchy, of a ranking of beings with intrinsic natural value. The second is the determination as to whether the domain of natural value coincides with that of environmental ethics. This may seem very obvious, but it's not at all. And third, the question as to whether the environmental ethics can actually overcome anthropocentrism or not. So let me explain them with some extension. Regarding the first problem, different locus of natural value have been proposed in environmental ethics. For instance, for ecocentrism, value is placed on totalities, such as ecosystems, the biosphere as a whole, the Earth, including both its living parts and non-organic elements or components. For biocentrism, it is the specific life forms that are valued. For zoocentrism or theocentrism, value is attributed to non-human animals, or at least those with the capacity to have a subjective experience of suffering. This is maybe one of the most popular approaches in environmental ethics. The reasons presented to justify the attribution of natural value are different in its approach. If it's ecocentric or biocentric or zoocentric, you are valuing different things. It can be ecosystem integrity, to fulfill organisms' potential, to have a good of its own, to have an interest, among many others. Taken together, they are not always compatible with each other. Why? Well, because there's a conflict of interest among the different values. For example, a given species, invasive, can endanger the stability of an ecosystem of a landscape. So to protect the stability of the ecosystem or the landscape, maybe you have to eliminate or to displace a given species. So what do you value the most? Another problem, one other example, can be that the value of a species, for instance an endangered species, does not need to coincide necessarily with the aggregate value of the interest of its individual members in not suffering, but rather with its role within the ecosystem. In this case, what do you protect? It could be at some time necessary to eliminate some individuals for the good of the whole. We can imagine some other examples of that. And this conflict of interest between different natural values is the reason why we have different isms: ecocentrism, physiocentrism, biocentrism, and so many others. I mean, the list can be really long. in this approach in environmental ethics. Therefore, any minimally coherent approach to environmental ethics is thus forced to establish some form of hierarchy for the different natural values. In other words, an axiological gradualism, and to assign or recognize more value to certain beings over others. And this is the reason why we have these different isms within environmental ethics. There are different answers to this problem of the conflict of interest in values. Regarding the second question, insofar as environmental ethics goes hand in hand with the relational conception of nature, the defense of the value of nature does not always form part of environmental ethics. Such is the case of the most widespread form of physiocentrism, scienticism. Its most widely influential version, inspired by Peter Singer, holds that animals with sentience are who possess intrinsic value. Who possess intrinsic value. Therefore, other kinds of entities without this capacity, such as the plant kingdom, the vegetal kingdom, and wholes, including species, biodiversity, ecosystems, and the natural environment, lack intrinsic value. The tensions between the growing animal rights movement and environmentalism illustrate this tension, making it essential to define the boundaries between the sphere of environmental ethics and that of natural value. What I'm saying is that natural values and intrinsic values do not overlap, and that natural values and environmental ethics are not exactly the same field. Recognizing natural values does not imply value in the environment. Regarding the third question, as we can see, the different approaches to environmental ethics must assume some form of axiological hierarchy. In most approaches, humanity, or part of it, is located at the top, under the assumption that its faculties are unique or greater than those of non-humans. Self-awareness, sensitivity, rationality, morality, and so on. Then, other natural values are ranked below. In all the approaches, including those that most radically avoid anthropocentrism, such as deep ecology, it is humans who identify the natural values. Then the environmental ethics moves along this tension between overcoming anthropocentrism in the normative sense, which means recognizing values in nature, and anthropocentrism in the epistemic sense, as the valuators are always humans. That tension lies at the heart of the concept of intrinsic value. Are always humans who recognize intrinsic values. So I'm not sure if, at least in the epistemic sense, it is conceptually possible to overcome anthropocentrism. This idea of intrinsic value, besides that, is very tricky in philosophical terms. It assumes the a priori existence of natural values regardless of the valuator. So human beings recognize intrinsic values, yet do not assign or create them. If the human species were eliminated, disappear from this planet, values, intrinsic values, would still be there, according to this approach. Besides that, environmental ethics tend to understand that moral valuation is non-derivative and is therefore unconditioned. It's not instrumental. If the recognition was derivative or conditioned, it would be instrumental, not intrinsic. This is a problematic stance, for if natural values are considered non-derivative, they are not only independent of instrumental interest, but also they are independent of human nature. a terminology more consistent with contemporary natural science should leave room for natural values as appraised and ranked vis-a-vis human nature, its history and evolutionary background, including moral emotions such as empathy and the capacity for altruism. So the root of this tension, of this, I would say, problematic, resides in the widespread assigned equivalence of instrumental and economic value within the field of environmental ethics, resulting in the use of intrinsic value. In this field, in environmental ethics, instrumental sounds as always driven by self-interest. So instrumental is always suspicious in this approach. To me, we should not concede that the value inspired by motivations or drivers like altruism, for instance, is instrumental in the economic or selfish sense. But this is what the language of intrinsic value presumes. My assessment, my final remarks on this first approach will be something like that. On the positive side, from the standpoint of practicality, the language of intrinsic value that we are finding today in these rights of nature movement and legislation. So from the positive side, this language of intrinsic value has been very successful, as it has translated the aspiration to respect natural otherness for non-economic and non-chromatistic reasons. Rights for nature is the paradigm of this success. On the negative side, intrinsic value is a very tricky concept. It presumes a sort of domain of Platonic values that do not fit very well within an ecological evolutionary framework, which is the departing point of the relational view of nature we have in any approach in environmental ethics. Besides that, finally, in any case, intrinsic values must be clearly graded. These difficulties presented by the language of intrinsic value have not prevented its predominance in moral philosophy related to the environment, to the extent that the term environmental ethics, as I said before, is usually understood as a synonym of the whole field. It's almost a taboo today to criticize the idea of intrinsic value in environmental ethics. However, there are other approaches. I will refer briefly to some other approaches, what I will call ecological ethics and climate ethics, but very briefly for two reasons. The first one is because these two approaches are almost invisible in the rights of nature legislation. The second one is that they avoid using the language of intrinsic value. But still, I would like at least to present them, because I think that if I had to organize my library on moral philosophy and environment, I will have 3 different groups of books and not just one. So sometimes, for me, it's difficult to accept this identification between environmental ethics based on the intrinsic value idea and the reflection in moral philosophy and the environment in a broader sense. So these two approaches I will refer very briefly are secondary, if not marginal, in rights of nature movement. So the first, the second approach, this is ecological ethics. This approach is based on the notion of the human right to the environment in a specific sense, as a socio-ecological metabolism. Given that this perspective views nature as an ecosystem, it can be defined as ecological ethics, although there's no consensus on the use of this terminology. This is maybe my label, more than their label. This approach is obviously human-centered. Natural values are values for human, so they are values of nature for humans, in particular a value which is sustainability. Sustainability understood in ecological terms as the preservation of natural capital, including resources and natural services, ecological services. So this approach is let's say, pretty radical in general terms. This socio-metabolic approach focuses on the way in which environmental resources and services are appropriated and distributed among human beings. Indicators such as the ecological footprint, so well known today, the human appropriation of net primary production, the material footprint, and so on, are systematically used to illustrate material ecological exchange as a space for the unequal distribution of the environment and the access to environmental goods, and as a process of net consumption of natural capital, life-supporting systems, which is unsustainable over time and unjust, unfair. The principles of justice adduced to define this distribution as unjust differ in each case, although they usually stem from the notion of human rights. So access to the goods of life-supporting systems is a precondition of human existence, including health, physical integrity, well-being, right to recreation, aesthetic enjoyment, scientific research. So the spectrum of, let's say, the values that are being protected or are being covered under this idea of sustainability is much wider than just an ecological space in the terms of the ecological footprint imagination, for instance. I'm sure that you are familiar to some extent with this idea of the natural, of the ecological footprint. Well, I would say that there are three main challenges to this approach. If I wanted to do a similar reflection that I did on the first approach on environmental ethics, the protection of the critical environmental values, the value of environmental goods compared to non-environmental values. But I will stop just on the last one, irreversible nature. From the point of view, this sustainability, ecological ethics approach is problematic. The environmental ethicist asks, what about environmental goods, resources and services that are not critical to human life or life support systems and that cannot be substituted? For instance, a specific landscape that you love or that has an important symbolic value in some specific context, or a unique animal species whose loss will not endanger sustainability. In Hawaii, they have hundreds of different species of snails. So probably the disappearance of one or some of them will not endanger the ecological stability, sustainability of the islands, of the archipelago. The answer that we can find in the, I would say, the most ambitious and elaborated works in this field, in moral philosophy, in this ecological approach, is that there is a wide range of instrumental values in nature, such as sensual delight, aesthetic, identity, cultural meaning, pedagogic, meaning of life, scientific, and so on. So a whole spectrum of values that are not easy to reduce prone to be reduced to just material flows, energy and material. Two, which is believed future generations should be entitled as much as the current generations, so that it would be unfair to destroy natural entities that grant these values, natural entities with this feature of being non-substitutable and who are not critical for life support systems. So, quoting Andy Dobson, features of non-human nature whose loss will be irreversible. So, based on the principle of equal opportunity, the protection of irreversible nature, therefore, serves as a strategy for an indirect protection under the criterion of strong sustainability, which means that we accept that there is low or zero substitutability between natural goods and some other goods like income or technology, for instance. So, in a non-direct way, defending the value of sustainability will provide extensive protection for the environment, including this non-critical nature. So this is more or less the answer that ecological ethicists can give to the suspicion of an environmental ethicist. More or less it's something like that. Don't worry, because our values, our approach, will defend your intrinsic values without using the category of intrinsic values. You can imagine that this answer is also problematic, because non-human nature whose loss will be irreversible includes viruses like COVID, for instance, or pathogens or diseases. So at the end, this answer reproduces the problem we found in environmental ethics. We need to rank values. We need an axiological gradualism. So the difficulties from this approach to give an answer to that is the reason why is one of the reasons why environmental ethics pretends to give a better answer to the problem of preserving some important, some specific parts of nature, some natural entities that are not easily defended under the justifications coming from ecological ethics. So my conclusion in this approach is that we face more or less the same problems as with environmental ethics. The language of ecological values makes sense only under the condition of a ranking of values. In this case, we have a top on the ranking, a clear top, which is sustainability. So integrity and stability of ecological systems. And we have another, let's say, advantage, is that in this case, we don't have to use the notion of intrinsic value, which I find very problematic. But the problem still persists. In the third approach, climate ethics, I'm sure that you are familiar with that because this is the fashion today. I mean, today it seems that environmental ethics or the moral philosophy on ethics is reduced to climate ethics. Climate change is virtually monopolizing the environmental ethics debate. So this approach of environmental ethics encompasses different moral dilemmas relating global warming. In particular, this approach is focused on the idea of climate justice. This terminology, climate justice, appears in some of the most important documents in the International Global Framework Convention on Climate Change, including the Paris Agreement, which has been developed to undertake action in the global arena to protect the climate on the basis of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Now you can see this is an official document from the framework. You can see the moral language in it. Climate ethics present unique features in this field of the moral philosophy of the environment. First, it is based on a metric of the anthropogenic carbon footprint, a measurement of equivalent tons of greenhouse gas emission. So it's easier to make comparisons compared to some other approaches. It is easier to make operative. Second, there is a relative, but not total, consensus on the need to aspire to the lowest possible temperature increase scenario. So there's almost an agreement in climate ethics on the value, which is climate stability through emissions reductions. Emissions should be below a critical threshold that precludes catastrophic climate change. Finally, the ethical reasons in this case are very easily translated into the practice through the global climate governance regime. Thus, climate ethics primarily focus on the question of what principles of justice is the most plausible in order to justify obligations and rights in terms of carbon emissions and the goals of the global climate governance regime. Well, this is a figure presenting the main principles of climate justice. I would say that the bulk of the production in climate ethics turns around the discussion of these principles. Which one is the most plausible principle to be applied from an ethical point of view, which is easier to justify from a philosophical point of view. I won't explain that. I mean, we have, let's say, in one extreme, this emissions egalitarianism, which is very intuitive. You can imagine what it means. Distributing an ideal equal share of sustainable emissions for the whole humankind. And the other part, and the other extreme, we have the grandfathering, which is exactly the opposite. Grandfathering means something like tradition creates rights. So if we were a polluter in the past, we have still today the same right in proportional terms to be a polluter. If you are not a polluter, and if you are a victim of climate change, is your problem. This is because you didn't take advantage of that possibility in the past. So we have a whole spectrum of principles on that. Each principle addresses the different ethical dilemmas in diverse ways. There are lots of dilemmas in climate change, as you can imagine. How we distribute in intergenerational terms, for instance, emissions. Do we have to repair past emissions and to compensate because of past emissions? How we do distribute the cost of transitions to a low emissions or zero carbon emissions scenario. Well, I will very briefly highlight, Okay. I would highlight three different challenges in climate ethics, as I did with environmental ethics. But very briefly, I will refer to just the main idea of them, because they can be useful in my reflection on the rights of nature that I will come back in brief. So the first problem is the pluralism of principles, because in the climate governance regime, all these principles are used at the same time. They are applied at the same time in different parts of the climate governance regime. This is called usually pluralism of principles. So climate governance is based on a combination of a mix of these different principles. But if you remember the examples I mentioned, this emissions egalitarianism, so different from grandfathering, you can imagine that this mix of principles is pretty incoherent, is a real chaos in my opinion. The whole thing is surprising. The second problem, which is a consequence of that pluralism of principles, is that this may be one of the reasons why the climate governance regime is not working at all in preventing climate crisis. In the scientific community, no one believes today that the Paris Agreement was mentioned in the Mar-Menor legislation I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, as something which is equated, is at the same level somehow with the ecocentric turn in rights of nature legislation. So today no one believes in the scientific world that the Paris Agreement will keep climate warming below the 2 Celsius degree critical zone. In fact, actually today, which is accepted in the whole scientific community, is that the goal of preservation under the current framework convention and the global climate governance regime, preservation means preventing dangerous anthropogenic interference with Earth's climate system, has been foregone in favor of mitigation and adaptation. So today no one, or almost no one, believes that preventing climate change is possible. The third problem, I just will mention it, is these sort of unilateral carbon metrics which bases this approach in climate ethics. So this unilateralism in carbon emissions conceals all the dimension of the environmental crisis. So this practicability of this approach and the way in which we can make very easily comparisons between different principles and scenarios, in fact, is a trap, because this is based in a very strong reduction of the spectrum of environmental problems and the different natural values we have to face from a, let's say, moral philosophical point of view. Well, these are the three approaches. Now I pass to my final considerations, and I will go back to this idea of rights of nature legislations. So my final considerations will try to understand this idea of rights of nature in this current movement, in this specific sense and context, within this history of the philosophical reflection on the ethics and the environment, and what are natural values. From this review of the three approaches, environmental, ecological, and climate, I would say that what is clear is that they are simply different. They respond in a different manner to the ethical dilemmas of the human relationship with the environment, from different assumptions, different ranking of values, and even a different concept of value. Besides that, they are only consistent in specific versions with specific principles, which clearly face the problem of ranking the different values in conflict. Now, if we look back at the example of the Mar-Menor, what we find behind the declaration of a natural entity as a legal person is a mix, is a puzzle of ethics. This is the pattern I mentioned before. The claim of an ecocentric turn in the legal system. We have seen ecocentrism means something very particular. In rights of nature legislation, this is mixed with some other categories and arguments that somehow come from different approaches. So it means some sort of lack of coherence at the end. The strategy of considering a natural entity as a legal person, a mix of ecocentric and anthropocentric values coming from different approaches, different languages, the development of the legal mechanisms of action for protection, and the goal of protecting the environment. So, still, in rights of nature legislation, there's clearly a predominance and hegemony of the environmental ethics intrinsic value approach. I will stop here for a while. This is just my final remarks on that. The expression rights of nature has a long history dating back at least to the 60s, hand in hand with environmental ethics. Shortly after, it already appears in legal documents, thanks above all, to the enormous influence of the jurist Christopher Stone's paper, 1972, Should Trees Have Standing? In that paper, and some books afterwards, Stone defines the idea of standing in legal terms. It means that you or your representative, this is the idea of REIT, action for protection, tutela, have the right to bring a lawsuit as an injured part. The injured part being some natural entity. However, Stones, in his works, shares with his sources in environmental ethics the premise that legal standing is grounded in moral standing. So, if an entity is granted legal standing, it's because it is morally worthy of its own. So, the law comes to recognize the deserved moral status. It does not create it, which is more or less the same we find in this category of intrinsic value, as I mentioned before. So, last 2 decades, there has been a boom in rights of nature legislation. Here we have a list. And this is just the half of it. And I'm missing some examples, I'm sure of that. Tamaqua Borough in Pennsylvania, it was a municipality ordinance that afterwards was declared unconstitutional. It opened the box, let's say, and afterwards we had the well-known constitutional rights of nature in Ecuador, the law of Mother Earth or Pachamama in Bolivia, some other case in Ecuador, in the river Vilcabamba, the Uruvera forest in New Zealand, the Lake Erie in Ohio, afterwards declared unconstitutional, the orangutan Sandra in Argentina, the chimpanzee Cecilia in Argentina, another river in New Zealand, also in a Maori territory as the Uruvera forest. The rivers Gang and Yamuna in India, the glaciers Gangotri and Yamunotri, which are the glaciers that feed Gang and Yamuna, the Atrato River in Colombia, the Colombian Amazon rainforest, all rivers in Bangladesh, all rivers are legal persons in Bangladesh, all the national territory of Uganda as nature is considered, is deemed a legal person also. The same in the Osaka state in Mexico, in the regional state constitution, the Mar Menor in Spain, which is the last one, as far as I know, and the next one seems that will be the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, which is almost about to be declared. In all these cases, we have this idea of legal person, natural entities as legal persons. You can see that the spectrum is very heterogeneous. We have great apes, we have rivers, glaciers, forest, the nature as a whole, Mother Earth. So we have different, very different, let's say, non-human entities or natural entities, which are considered legal persons. So there's a tendency in this process, there's a tendency to use the principle, the criterion, the concept of the intrinsic value. Still, there's no necessary relationship between both. Sometimes the idea of a legal person is used without reference to intrinsic value. In fact, this is always the case with companies or corporations. I wonder whether the Danish Philosophical Society is a legal person in the Danish legislation. Maybe you are. Maybe the society is a legal person. But I don't think that you use this idea of intrinsic value if your society is a legal person in your legislation. So the two concepts, the two categories can be used in an independent manner. In other cases, intrinsic value can be used without declaring the legal personality of the natural entity. So we have environmental legislation who uses this idea of intrinsic value without following the strategy of declaring a natural entity legal person or personality. However, the tendency more and more is a marriage between the two. Natural entity is a legal person because of the intrinsic value. I will put here some examples. I will read from some fragments taken from this legislation, these two lists of legislation. In India, environmental justice means that we drift away from the principle of anthropocentric to ecocentric. Again, in India, the state is a custodian of natural resources, but for the best interests of flora, and fauna, wildlife, and so on, not merely for the benefit of the public. So the state is responsible in front of the flora and fauna, not to people, let's say. Every species has an inherent right, which is more or less synonymous of intrinsic. Animal has also honor and dignity, which cannot be arbitrarily deprived. Great apes are sentient beings, which are subjects of non-human rights. Argentina. Colombia, the elements of nature, such as forests, the atmosphere, rivers, mountains, ecosystems, so on, have to be safeguarded, not for the role they play in the survival of human beings, but because they are subjects of individual rights as living beings. Accordingly, while exercising the parents' patria jurisdiction, the rivers Ganga and Yamuna have the status of a legal person with all corresponding rights, duties, a river with duties, and liabilities of a living person in order to preserve and conserve River Ganga and Yamuna. Okay, these are just some examples of this. Another characteristic feature of this movement is the feedback between sources and jurisprudence. So the declarations refer to some specific theoretical sources, especially Stone and some classics of environmental ethics, and to the arguments used in past declarations. So there is a growing similarity between the different declarations. There's a circularity of the language and the references. Likewise, the environmental advocacy groups that tend to press for these initiatives, as in the case of Mar Menor, you could see that images of the demonstrations, these groups tend to press for these initiatives inspired by the same theoretical sources, the classics of environmental ethics. So this is clearly a theory effect of philosophy in the rights of nature legislation. I'm using this theory effect idea coming from Pierre Bourdieu's philosophy. So high theory, sophisticated, scholar, elaborated philosophy through a very complex process of translation, can have some effect outside the academy. So the translation of theory and jurisprudence requires a translation process. We have seen cases occur on all continents in very different cultures and languages. However, the strategy based on the language of rights and the category of personhood is almost universal. This triggers many suspicions among post-colonial authors. They consider that in many cases, in particular such those of New Zealand and the Maori community and Bolivia, the Aymara community, indigenous communities, in those cases, indigenous communities and the visions of the world are deformed and shaped and subjected to a Western rights of nature orthodoxy, eco-theological, liberal, modernist, functional to capitalism. The result of this translation is usually a mix of values around two axes, non-human nature intrinsic value and human-centered environmental sustainability. Still, the first is prominent. More recently, a third axis on climate responsibility is becoming more and more important, but this is very recent. As I mentioned before, the mix does not face the challenges posed by the intellectual philosophical discussion, namely that of the hierarchy between the different values, between different natural entities, including humans. Declarations presume that the rights of nature legal strategy, based on this idea of legal person, helps the different values at the stake to mutually enforce each other. So considering declaring some specific natural entity as a legal person, enforce the rights of the future generations, enforce sustainability for human purposes, and so on each other. This pluralism of values, this axiological pluralism, presents some features that we have seen in the climate change governance regime. Lack of coherence makes more difficult for the legislation to success, to work properly. Still, this axiological pluralism we find in this rights of nature legislation is facing the fact that law systems are hierarchical. So they rank rights, values, and interest. So this axiological pluralism in the rights of nature movement or legislation will be put into some order as far as the rights of nature legislations will be tested, enforced, and interpreted. In fact, this is what's happening, for instance, already in Ecuador. That is to say, like in so many other examples, ethical dilemmas in rights of nature implementation, in this case, will be solved or arranged politically. Let me end with a brief list of conclusions from these last reflections. First, nothing in a declaration of a natural entity as a legal person grants more rights to nature, neither more protection. Nothing in these declarations grants more protection for the natural entities which are declared legal persons. It will depend on how these abstract declarations will be interpreted and enforced by the legal system. Second, still, the right to action protection, the entitlement for anyone to take legal action in front of a judge, of a court, on behalf of the interest of a natural entity, this is very important in practical terms. It empowers citizens in, for instance, environmental advocacy groups in what I just called the political arrangement of ethical dilemmas. So this is something I will find positive in any case. Third, to achieve that, so to empower citizenry in the defense of nature using this strategy, do we need the language of intrinsic value? I don't think so. Fourth, do we need the language of personhood? Do we need this personification of nature? Pay attention on these expressions that I presented before. The best interest of flora and fauna, the duties of a river, the honor of animals, the mar menor as a true interest party. I think that we don't need this sort of language. From an ethical point of view, I found it very controversial. And 5, why the idiom and the imagination of the ecocentrism, this particular version of environmental ethics, is displacing some others, like climate ethics or ecological ethics, in the rights of nature movement? So for sure there are many reasons. You can imagine that I can stop in them now. Huh? I would say that this has a lot to do with the spirit of our times, with the inclination of global public opinions and national public opinions to feel more comfortable with these sort of languages. So I think that the reasons might have to do with this sort of zeitgeist than with ethical reasons. And I stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for a rich lecture. Let's have questions.
Hello, my name is Jørgen. Thank you for a very detailed and rich presentation of what has been going on the last 50 years on this front, so to speak. Didn't I hear you mention the Norwegian philosopher Arne Næss?
Arne Næss, yeah.
Yeah, yes, okay. Oh, I'm glad to hear that he has finally reached Spain after he died for 10 years ago. Yes, I think it's interesting that I know you do this for historical reasons. It's interesting that you place him as an environmental ethics because he was one of the first who deliberately and very explicitly founded or sort of established ecological ethics and uses this as one of his primary books, early books, to establish this whole idea of that we cannot escape anthropocentrism, but we can say that we are being anthropocentric in a trivial sense. Mm-hmm. The point is how we reach and come to terms with one of the biggest cultural, historical challenges of our centuries by moving the targets, or moving the limits of what can be done. And I think your presentation has showed very good how you move from A to B to C, that this is sort of climbing into the legal justice. It is very interesting to see that the more you get from environmental to climate ethics, the more difficult it becomes, because it becomes less and less academic, and at the same time it becomes more a question of how do we implement the whole thing. That there is no, in my point of view, there's no directly contradiction from the first step to the second one, or to the third one, because these 50 years has shown how important it is to go in that direction. And Næss is talking about that you should be able to identify yourself with other life forms. And your great point is that we have to maintain this embeddedness with all other life forms, and you have to do it into a legal subject. I don't think it's a problem to use this personhood, because it sort of enhances the very idea of being able to put it into a legal practice. If you don't do that, you risk of ending up making a sort of a speculative nature philosophy. Are you familiar with the Italian philosopher Emmanuel Coccia?
No.
No, okay. But he's sort of making far out, so to speak, in metaphysics, who is saying we have to give all the plants rights, we have to give the whole earth rights, and we have to understand this is all brought together. And then suddenly the ecological is not enough. But I thank you for your presentation and that you mentioned Arnes, because it warms my heart that he's sort of being, in the long run, has influenced your perspective as a whole. Thank you.
Okay. Well, there are so many questions, and I'm sure that I won't be able to say something coherent to just some of them. So Arnes, I'm sure that I'm not pronouncing it properly. Almost. Okay, thank you. Yes. So Arnes was translated into Spanish many years ago. No, not everything, of course, but you can find some specific chapters of books and I would say articles and papers. And you have a very good ontology on environmental ethics with the translation of the main text in the history of environmental ethics. But it was done in Mexico, not in Spain. So in Spain we have, like I would say, a long tradition in moral and political philosophy in environmental ethics in the broad sense. When I arrived to the academy 25 years ago, there were a group of young scholars at that moment that were introduced in that field, in the philosophy, that questions in the philosophy, but usually they were despised. I would say traditional scholars discredit these sort of issues. They consider that if they were outside the canon, so there's no important in philosophy. So what's important is what Hegel or Spinoza or Aristotle can show us about these problems, but not these new approaches. No? But I mean, we have access to this sort of readings. No? So, I mean, in my ideal world, we didn't have to use the word nature. So everything is nature. I mean, if we consider that nature coincides with living nature, so it means that the moon is not nature. So in those cases, I can accept that we will need the concept of nature to distinguish which is living from the rest. But in the broad sense, I mean, nature is everything. So if we have to use this difference between nature and humans, or non-human, or non-nature, or culture, or society, or whatever it's called, is because we are trapped in the web of anthropocentrism somehow. So totally, I adopt, I share with you this value of embeddedness with the environment, and unfortunately in philosophy we have to remind that once and once again, because Western philosophy is somehow built on the assumption that to some extent humans are not natural. So I agree with you on that. I hope that my presentation didn't look as an attempt to discredit, I would say, this goal. Not at all. Still, I'm very uncomfortable with this language of intrinsic value. I think this is a sort of, as I mentioned before, is a sort of Neoplatonism. It's a sort of metaphysics, which is as the opposite side in philosophical terms with the materialistic, naturalistic, evolutionary tradition in which environmental ethics, ecological ethics is grounded and based. So I think that we have a problem. We have a real problem on that. Besides that, this idea of intrinsic value, I mean, for corporations, money is intrinsic value. So I don't think it's that clear that intrinsic value is something that nature possesses. Institutions, like corporations, can have their idea of intrinsic value. In any case, I wonder, I share also your worry about what's the alternative for that. What should be done? And your question, what can be done, I'm thinking about that question in philosophical terms. What can be done in a context like this? I'm not thinking about politics or society or economy, where I'm sure that we would agree that much more should be done, but it's very difficult to change things. This strategy of the personhood, legal personhood in the rights of nature movement is one attempt to find a new way to do more than we did until now in order to have a more embedded relation and sustainable relation with our environment. I don't think it is a bad strategy. So, as I said, corporations and associations and societies are, in many legal systems, legal persons. In some cases, ships, boats are legal persons. In India, spirits and ancestors are legal persons. So I don't think it's a problem to use this strategy, as some others use the same strategy, usually with opposite goals, like corporations usually do. But I think that we should use this strategy using a different language. And I think that this strategy of the rights of the legal personhood in the rights of nature movement is so dependent on the intrinsic value that it leads to this sort of sentences I mentioned before. The lagoon as the truly interest party, the honor of the animal. Well, I think dangerous, this sort of language. I think that philosophy and ethics at the end has benefited from the secular. And I think that this sort of language is a going back to magical thinking, to animism. There's a debate in the rights of nature literature. There's a debate to whether this is a new sort of animism. And surprisingly, you have a very strong stream of authors defending that this is animism, and what's the problem? At the end, these authors, somehow inspired by deconstructionist or post-structuralist philosophy, like Bruno Latour, they say, okay, we have to escape from this Western mechanicistic, dualistic worldview in which philosophy is based. So let's try with animism. What's the problem? I think this is a problem. I think that this is a step backwards in the history of philosophy, in this case in legislation. Finally, do you think that these three approaches are not contradictory among them? No? Not always. I mean, I could imagine a climate ethics which is compatible with the goals of sustainability, and an ecological ethics which is more or less coincident with the scope of worries by environmental ethics. But usually it's not the case. Think, for instance, about James Lovelock, defense of nuclear energy and technology under the value of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, so to control climate change. I don't think this is coherent. This very strong climate ethics approach by James Lovelock, I don't think this is coherent with sustainability in some sense, or with environmental ethics, just to put one example. Another example, the Constitution of Ecuador and this defense of nature, and the same with Pachamama in Bolivia. So in those countries, judges are already facing the problem of answering to a specific lawsuits and to interpret the law of Pachamama, the law of Mother Earth, and the Constitution. And for instance, they are allowing extractive mining by part of corporations, but no for the local communities. But in any case, they are allowing, as if it was not contradictory with the declaration of Pachamama as a legal person, extractive mining. I mean, the case in Bolivia, for instance, is spectacular. I mean, Bolivia is producing the bulk of lithium for batteries in our electric new cars. And this was found by judges not contradictory with the defense of Pachamama. So I think that it can be a contradiction between these three different approaches. Okay, I'm not sure if it was an answer. It's more or less what I can say.
It was a very rich answer to a very rich question.
Very long.
Yeah, exactly. So actually, maybe we should actually have something to eat.
Okay.
I wonder. Yes.
It was another.
Yeah, but he was hungry.
Okay.
Maybe if he can give a short question and a short answer.
Okay.
Yes. Then you give your son a very short question and a very short answer.
Thank you for a very exciting and rich lecture. I'll do it short. Would you be open to a non-Platonic concept of intrinsic value? For instance, a concept of intrinsic value that has response dependence in its way of framing what value is. Response dependence of sentient beings, for instance. It doesn't seem to be Platonic in my view.
Okay. I'm not sure if I understand this idea of
analogy to color, for
dependence.
instance. Color seems to be around us and a part of nature,
Okay.
but they seem to exist only because we are responding as sentient beings to them in some sense. So their existence is derived, so to speak, from our sentience.
Okay, their existence is derived from our relation with colors.
No, our relation is to them.
To them, okay. But do you think that this is a value? Yeah. Do you think that this is a value? So I can accept that these are properties of some specific being that are recognized or are appraised in a specific relation. But I wouldn't use the term value for that.
Why not?
In the moral sense. Value in the moral sense. I wouldn't use value for that. I mean, imagine that there were no human beings. You will have some other species interacting with those natural entities, and those natural entities will come into existence as part of the relationship with these observers, these other species. It will be value there without human beings?
If they are sentient beings that are able to experience value.
what will be value in that sense?
The negative value of suffering or the positive value of pleasure, to take some basic examples.
But this is instrumental. I mean, within the language of environmental ethics.
I disagree.
Really?
It's a long discussion.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I will think about that. Maybe for sure I'm wrong. Okay.
Thank you very much, Joaquin. Thank you for inspiring lecture.
Thank you.